In 2023, a military commander in West Africa made a decision that would trigger one of the most intense information wars of the decade, and almost nobody outside the region saw it coming. What you're about to hear challenges everything you thought you knew about who controls the narrative in global conflicts. Because right now, as you're watching this, there's a war happening that doesn't involve guns or tanks. It's happening in newsrooms, in NGO offices, and across social media. And one man decided to fight back in a way that shocked the Western establishment. His name is Ibrahim Traoré. And his retaliation just exposed a system that most people don't even know exists. Let's rewind. 4 decades, West Africa existed in a particular kind of order. France had the resources. America had the surveillance. International NGOs had the narrative. If you controlled those 3 things, you controlled the country, even if you never fired a shot. The system was elegant, almost invisible. Local governments nominally led their nations, but the real decisions? Those happened in Paris, Washington, and New York. Burkina Faso was no exception. By 2020, the country was spiraling. Terrorist insurgencies in the Sahel were metastasizing. The government seemed powerless. Schools were closing. Villages were being emptied. The military was either unable or unwilling to stop it. So when a young officer named Ibrahim Traoré seized power in January 2022, many in the West initially thought it might be manageable, another African strongman, they assumed, who could be guided, pressured, or eventually replaced. They were wrong. What happened next revealed something nobody expected. Traoré didn't just want military control. He wanted sovereignty. Real sovereignty. The kind that meant making decisions without consulting Paris first. The kind that meant choosing your own allies, even if those allies were Russia and China. And that's when the information machinery activated. Within months, Western media outlets began publishing reports of mass atrocities. Human Rights Watch released allegations. The BBC investigated. Al Jazeera documented. The narrative crystallized. Traoré's military was conducting massacres. The numbers grew. 1,700 civilians. 1,800. Maybe more. The stories were detailed, emotionally devastating, and almost impossible to verify because, convenient timing, Traoré had expelled foreign journalists and NGOs from the country. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Burkina government didn't just deny the allegations. They demanded evidence. Specific evidence. Names of victims. Dates. Locations. GPS coordinates of mass graves. And when the international organizations couldn't provide it, or wouldn't, Traoré's government made a shocking claim. These reports were fabricated. Not exaggerated. Not contested. Fabricated. Part of a coordinated campaign to delegitimize his rule and justify a future military intervention. In other words, an information war. Now, you might think this is just typical geopolitical he said, she said. But what makes this story extraordinary is what happened when Traoré realized the traditional denial wasn't working. He didn't hire a better PR firm. He didn't write op-eds for Western newspapers. Instead, he did something far more radical. He flipped the entire narrative framework. If Western organizations could operate inside Burkina Faso, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, documenting atrocities, then maybe their reports would have credibility. But they can't operate there anymore. So Traoré asked a simple question. How can you claim to know what's happening inside a country you've been expelled from? How can you present testimony as fact when you haven't actually been on the ground to verify it? How can you demand that the government prove its innocence when you're the one making the accusation? The logic was airtight. And it put Western media organizations in an impossible position. This is where most people miss the real story. Because what Traoré had done was expose not just potential media bias, but the entire infrastructure of how narratives are constructed in the modern geopolitical system. He showed that when you control who gets access, you control what story gets told. And if you deny that access, you can question the authenticity of any narrative your enemies create. But that's still not the full story. The real escalation came when Traoré's government began making claims of its own. Foreign military operations. Drone surveillance. Covert attempts to destabilize the regime. And then something happened that seemed to validate every claim he'd made. Evidence started emerging of actual foreign surveillance drones operating over Burkina territory. Not alleged. Actual. Documented. Shot down. This was the turning point. Because now Traore could point to the drones and say, "You see? While you're accusing us of atrocities, your own governments are conducting military operations against us." It shifted the entire frame. Suddenly, he wasn't a military dictator denying human rights accusations. He was a leader defending his country against foreign interference. The victim, not the perpetrator. And here's the thing that really matters. For millions of people in Burkina Faso and across West Africa, that reframing worked. Domestic support for Traoré actually strengthened. Not because people believed atrocities hadn't happened. Conflict in that region had created legitimate casualties. But because they saw their leader standing up to Western powers in a way previous leaders never had. They saw him choosing partners based on national interest, not Western preference. They saw him refusing to play by the old rules. Meanwhile, France, which had maintained military bases in Burkina Faso for years, found itself unwelcome. American influence evaporated, and Traoré turned toward Russia and China with open arms. Now, here's where geopolitics and information warfare intersect in a way that most people completely miss. The Western response to losing influence in Burkina Faso was to intensify the narrative campaign. More human rights reports. More media investigations. More international pressure. But every story they published was greeted with the same response: you have no journalists on the ground. You have no independent verification. This is part of your information war against us. And the frustrating part, for the Western organizations, was that Traoré was right about one thing: they couldn't independently verify anything because they'd been expelled. So their reports, no matter how rigorous, would always be vulnerable to the accusation that they were based on incomplete information, potentially biased sources, or geopolitical motivations. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. What had been presented as evidence of atrocities became, in the eyes of the Burkina population and sympathetic international observers, evidence of an information campaign. The very fact that reports couldn't be independently verified became proof that they were untrustworthy. The expelled journalists became symbols of Western interference, not victims of authoritarian suppression. Traoré had weaponized epistemic skepticism. He'd made truth itself a battleground. But let's go deeper, because this story has layers most people don't see. The Sahel region, the vast semi-arid strip running across North Africa, sits on resources Western powers have wanted for decades. Uranium, gold, rare earth minerals, agricultural land, water, strategic position between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. For years, France maintained this influence through military bases, development aid, and the architecture of the French franc system in former colonies. America maintained it through surveillance, intelligence partnerships, and diplomatic leverage. When Traoré took power, he saw an opportunity. What if Burkina Faso played competitors against each other instead of submitting to one master? What if Russia offered military support? What if China offered infrastructure investment? What if he could extract better terms by having options? That's exactly what he did. And that's when the Western response shifted from influence to containment. Because losing Burkina Faso wasn't just about losing one country. It was about a model. If Traoré could successfully resist Western pressure, expel foreign military forces, align with Russia and China, and maintain domestic legitimacy, then other leaders might try the same thing. The entire post-Cold War order in Africa could destabilize. So the narratives intensified. The reports multiplied. The pressure campaigns escalated. And Traoré responded not by backing down, but by doubling down. By making the information war itself the story. By turning every accusation into evidence of foreign conspiracy. By using the very mechanisms of modern communication to amplify the message that Western powers were trying to control his country. Here's the psychological genius of what he did. He didn't need to prove the atrocity allegations were false. He just needed to create enough doubt about the sources, the motivations, and the independence of the accusers that people would question the narratives rather than accept them at face value. And in an information ecosystem where trust in institutions is already fragile, that's remarkably easy to do. Because let's be honest, Western governments do have strategic interests in Africa. France does maintain significant influence through colonial-era arrangements. America does conduct surveillance operations. International institutions do sometimes prioritize geopolitical stability over other concerns. All of this is true. All of it creates legitimate grounds for skepticism about Western-sourced narratives about African leaders. Traoré simply weaponized that legitimate skepticism. And the brilliance is that he did it while simultaneously conducting actual military operations that may or may not have resulted in civilian casualties. Because in an information war, the truth becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is what people believe about the truth. What matters is whether they trust the source telling them. What matters is whether the narrative fits their pre-existing worldview. For citizens of Burkina Faso watching their leader stand up to the West, the narrative fit perfectly. Their president wasn't a dictator denying atrocities, he was a patriot defending sovereignty. The expulsion of journalists wasn't suppression of free press, it was rejection of foreign interference. The military operations in remote areas weren't massacres, they were counter-terrorism operations. The same facts. Completely different stories. And that's the real revelation of this entire saga. In the modern geopolitical landscape, controlling the narrative has become nearly as important as controlling territory. Because if you can make people believe a story, they'll support you regardless of what's actually happening on the ground. Traoré understood this intuitively. He saw that the old model, where Western organizations could define the truth and local populations had to accept their version of reality, was collapsing. He saw that in a multipolar world, you could reject one narrative framework and adopt another. You could align with powers that wouldn't demand you adhere to their version of human rights or democracy. You could maintain domestic support by positioning yourself against external enemies. It was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that this situation reveals. We don't actually know what's happening in Burkina Faso with any certainty. Journalists are expelled, so they can't verify events independently. NGOs are banned, so they can't conduct investigations. The government controls all internal information flows. And every international report is immediately labeled as part of a Western conspiracy. In this epistemic fog, both the government's claims and the NGO's allegations become unfalsifiable. The government says it's fighting terrorists in forests, and it might be. The NGOs say it's massacring civilians, and it might be. Both could be true. Neither could be provable from outside the country. And that uncertainty is exactly what Traoré weaponized. Because uncertainty about the truth gives people permission to believe whatever narrative serves their interests. It creates space for multiple competing stories to coexist. It makes the very concept of objective fact seem like a Western imposition. So what does this mean for the future? If Traoré's model works, if he can maintain power while rejecting Western narratives, while aligning with Russia and China, while conducting military operations without international oversight or verification, then other leaders will notice. They'll see that the old rules no longer apply. They'll see that you can defy human rights organizations, expel foreign media, and maintain domestic legitimacy if you frame it as resistance to imperialism. The information war in Burkina Faso becomes a template for geopolitical resistance everywhere. But there's another possibility. If the Western narrative about atrocities is actually true, if real massacres did occur and Traoré's information campaign succeeded in obscuring them, then we've witnessed something even more troubling. The weaponization of skepticism and the collapse of shared reality so complete that actual human rights abuses become unprovable and undocumentable. In that scenario, the real victims are the civilians on the ground. Because in an information war, truth dies first. The fundamental question this story raises is this. In a world where every narrative is suspected of geopolitical motivation, where every source is potentially compromised, where access to information can be controlled through expulsion and borders, how do we know anything? How do we verify claims? How do we hold power accountable when the very concept of independent verification becomes impossible? Traoré solved that problem for himself by rejecting the need for external verification entirely. He created an information ecosystem where his narrative didn't need to be proven true. It just needed to be credible enough to his own population and aligned enough with their desires for sovereignty and independence. And that might be the most important lesson of this entire saga. In the 21st century, geopolitical power doesn't just flow from military capability or economic strength. It flows from the ability to control what people believe about reality itself. The side that can make its narrative stick, not because it's true, but because it's psychologically resonant and politically useful, wins. Traore understood this. He moved first. And now Western powers are scrambling to respond to a game they didn't even realize they were playing. The question isn't whether Burkina Faso's government is telling the truth or lying. The question is whether, in a fragmented information ecosystem where access and trust are weaponized, truth matters at all anymore. And that question doesn't have a comfortable answer.